Imagine the year 1483. Europe is still wrapped in old legends, believing that the edges of the ocean are filled with monsters and endless abysses. Maps run out long before the horizon does. But in Portugal, a man named Diogo Cão is about to prove that the world is a lot bigger and far more mysterious than anyone ever thought. Picture this: the wind howling, the salty spray stinging your face, and ahead of you, only the unknown. No charts, no GPS, just courage and the stars above you. Diogo Cão is not a nobleman, but a knight chosen by the king himself, trusted not for his blood, but for his skill and nerve. While most people are still telling tales about sea serpents and falling off the edge of the world, Cão is preparing to set sail to places so remote, even rumors haven't reached them yet. So what drives someone to face the unknown? Is it ambition? Is it pure courage? Or maybe it's the unshakable feeling that the world is bigger than the stories that keep us afraid. As Diogo Cão's small crew heads south along the African coast, every day is a battle between superstition and science. Some sailors still whisper about curses, while others, trained in the new techniques from the famous school of Sagres, trust their compasses and the wisdom of the stars. There's tension on board, between the old ways and the promise of discovery. Then comes the day that will change everything. Instead of the endless ocean, Diogo Cão and his men find themselves facing a river so wide they think it must be the sea. It is the Congo River, the largest on the continent. Cão marks this moment by raising a stone pillar with a cross, the Portuguese way of saying, "We were here, this land has been found." Here's a curious detail. To prove his journey to the king back home, Cão actually took 4 African nobles with him to Portugal. The trip was so harsh that only 2 survived, and when they returned, they became interpreters, helping to bridge worlds that had never met before. If you're the kind of person who loves true stories of adventure and discovery, ones that really shaped our world, then you don't want to miss this journey. Hit like, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. This is only the beginning. Picture this. The year is 1483. While most of Europe still believed the ocean was filled with sea monsters and endless abysses, one man dared to sail where no map existed. His name? Diogo Cão. His mission? To unlock the secrets of the African coast and stumble upon the continent's mightiest river, the Congo. But what he discovered there would forever change the course of Portuguese exploration and the fate of an entire African empire. What drives a person to challenge the unknown? Is it ambition, courage, or simply the unshakable belief that the world extends far beyond the myths that imprison it? If you love stories of real adventures that shaped our world, don't miss this incredible journey. Like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's set the scene. Portugal, under King John II, was desperately searching for sea routes that would take them around Africa to reach the Indies. The spice trade was the internet of the 15th century. Whoever controlled it, controlled enormous wealth and power. But there was one massive problem. Nobody knew if it was even possible to sail around Africa. The maps simply ended, replaced by ominous warnings about boiling seas and mythical creatures. Enter Diogo Cão, a man whose story reads like an adventure novel. He wasn't a nobleman born into privilege. He was a knight of the royal house, which meant he had earned his position through skill and determination. This wasn't just some wealthy aristocrat playing at exploration. This was a seasoned sailor who had proven himself worthy of the king's trust. But here's where it gets really interesting. Cão faced a challenge that went beyond just navigating uncharted waters. His crew was split between 2 worldviews that were literally at war with each other. On one side, you had the old-school sailors, their minds filled with centuries of superstitions about what lay beyond the known world. These men had grown up hearing tales of sea serpents so massive they could swallow entire ships, of waters that boiled under the African sun, of lands where the very ground would burn your feet. On the other side, you had the new generation of navigators, trained at the famous school of Sagres, where Henry the Navigator had revolutionized maritime science. These men understood astronomy, they could read the stars, and they believed in charts and compasses rather than myths and legends. Imagine the tension aboard those ships. Every day, as they sailed further south than any European had ever gone, the superstitious sailors would whisper among themselves. "We're sailing toward our doom," they'd mutter. "No good can come from defying God's natural boundaries." Meanwhile, the trained navigators would study their instruments, confident that science would guide them safely through the unknown. But here's a detail that might shock you. Diogo Cão actually captured 4 African nobles and brought them back to Portugal as proof of his discoveries. 2 of them died during the journey. Can you imagine the horror and confusion these men must have felt, torn from their homes and dragged across an ocean to a completely foreign land? The 2 survivors were baptized and later returned to serve as interpreters. It's a reminder that even the most celebrated explorations often came with a dark human cost. This wasn't just about drawing new lines on a map. Cão was stepping into a world where every decision could mean the difference between glory and death, between expanding an empire and losing everything in the vast Atlantic. The weight of expectation from his king, the fear and superstition of his crew, the complete uncertainty of what lay ahead. It's hard to imagine the psychological pressure this man must have faced every single day of his voyage. As his ships pushed further south along the African coast, Cão wasn't just exploring new lands. He was literally rewriting humanity's understanding of what was possible. Every mile they traveled was a mile further than anyone had ever gone and returned to tell the tale. Every sunrise brought them closer to either triumph or disaster. And then, in 1483, something happened that would change everything. But that's where our story really begins to get interesting. Now imagine this moment. After months of sailing along the African coast, threading carefully between jagged rocks and unknown currents, Diogo Cão suddenly spots something that makes him question everything he knows about geography. It's August of 1482, and his lookout calls down from the crow's nest with excitement in his voice. But what he's seeing doesn't make sense. There, stretching before them, is water that seems to go on forever. But this isn't the familiar blue of the ocean. This water is muddy, brown, carrying the rich sediment of an entire continent. The current is strange too, pushing against his ships in a way that ocean currents never do. At first glance, Cão thinks he's discovered an inland sea, some massive lake that the maps never showed. But then something clicks. The taste of the water, the color, the way it flows. This isn't a sea at all. This is a river. But what kind of river could be so impossibly wide that you couldn't see the other side? What kind of river could carry so much water that it changes the color of the ocean for miles around its mouth? What Diogo Cão had stumbled upon was the mouth of what the local people called the Zaire, what we know today as the Congo River. This wasn't just any river. This was the second longest river in Africa, carrying the waters of an area larger than India, flowing from deep in the heart of the continent all the way to the Atlantic. The force of all that water was so powerful that it pushed fresh water nearly 40 miles out into the ocean. But here's where Cão proved he wasn't just an explorer, he was a strategist. He understood that discovery meant nothing unless you could prove it, unless you could claim it for your king. So he did something that would echo through history. He ordered his men to unload one of the most important pieces of cargo they carried. These weren't ordinary supplies. Carefully stored in the ship's hold were massive stone pillars called padrões, carved from Portuguese limestone before the voyage even began. Each pillar stood several feet tall, topped with a cross representing the Order of Christ, and bore the Portuguese royal coat of arms carved deep into the stone. King John II had commissioned these specifically for this moment, not just to mark discoveries, but to claim them. Picture the scene. Portuguese sailors hauling this enormous stone pillar off their ship, struggling through the surf to get it onto dry land. This wasn't easy work. These padrões weighed hundreds of pounds, and moving them required careful planning and sheer physical effort. But Cão knew the symbolic power of what he was doing. He erected the first pillar right at the mouth of the Congo River, on what's now called Shark Point, as a permanent declaration of Portuguese sovereignty over this incredible discovery. Think about the audacity of this moment. Here was a man who had sailed further than any European before him, who had just discovered one of the world's great rivers, and his first instinct wasn't to celebrate or to explore. His first instinct was to plant a flag, to say, "This belongs to Portugal now." It's a perfect example of how exploration and empire building went hand in hand during the Age of Discovery. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. That stone pillar that Diogo Cão erected over 500 years ago, it's still there, weathered, damaged by centuries of storms and salt spray, but still standing as proof that this incredible voyage actually happened. Archaeologists and historians can walk up to that exact spot today and touch the same stone that Cão's men wrestled into place in 1482. The practical implications of what Cão was doing were enormous. These padrões weren't just symbolic, they were legal documents carved in stone. In an age before photography or detailed maps, these pillars served as undeniable proof of Portuguese presence. Any other European nation that came after would see these monuments and know that Portugal had been there first. But Cão wasn't satisfied with just marking the river's mouth. He was an explorer at heart, and this mysterious river called to him. So he made a decision that showed both his courage and his curiosity. He ordered his ships to sail upstream into completely unknown territory. No European had ever navigated these waters. No one knew what lay around the next bend. Hostile tribes, impassable rapids, or perhaps more wonders waiting to be discovered. As they sailed up the Congo, the landscape around them told the story of an entire continent. The muddy water carried traces of forests and mountains from thousands of miles inland. The banks revealed glimpses of a world that Europeans had never imagined: dense tropical vegetation, unfamiliar birds calling from the trees, and signs of human habitation that suggested this river was the highway of a sophisticated civilization. What Diogo Cão had found wasn't just a river, it was a doorway into the heart of Africa itself, and as he sailed upstream, he had no idea that he was about to encounter one of the most advanced kingdoms on the entire continent. As Diogo Cão sailed up the Congo River in 1483, he had no idea he was about to shatter every European assumption about African civilization. What he discovered would challenge everything Portugal thought it knew about the world beyond Europe. Picture the moment when Cão's lookouts first spotted signs of organized settlement along the riverbanks. These weren't simple fishing villages or nomadic camps. What they were seeing was evidence of something that European scholars insisted couldn't exist in Africa: sophisticated urban civilization. The smoke rising in the distance wasn't from random cooking fires. It was coming from organized cities with thousands of inhabitants. What Diogo Cão had stumbled upon was the Kingdom of Congo, a centralized and well-organized realm that had been thriving since around 1390. This wasn't some loose collection of tribes that European explorers often encountered. This was a legitimate kingdom with a sophisticated political structure ruled by the Manicongo, meaning lord or ruler, whose authority extended across several core provinces. But here's what must have truly amazed the Portuguese. The kingdom was prospering through regional trade of copper, ivory, and other goods, with established trade routes that connected the Atlantic coast to the interior of Africa. These people had mastered metallurgy, working copper and iron with skills that rivaled European craftsmanship. They had developed agricultural systems that supported large populations, and they had built cities with organized layouts that showed careful planning and administration. The capital city alone was a revelation. Here was an African metropolis with paved streets, organized markets, and administrative buildings that served a government structure more complex than many European kingdoms. The Congo people had developed their own systems of taxation, military organization, and diplomatic protocol. They had courts of law, systems of inheritance, and artistic traditions that had been refined over centuries. Now imagine the cultural shock on both sides of this encounter. The Portuguese arrived expecting to find what European mythology had taught them to expect in Africa: primitive peoples who would be awed by European technology and eager to trade trinkets for valuable resources. Instead, they found themselves face to face with sophisticated diplomats who understood trade negotiations, political alliances, and the complexities of international relations. When Cão made contact with the Congo Kingdom, he followed established Portuguese practice by taking some Congo nobles back to Portugal, while leaving some of his own men in Congo. But this wasn't simple kidnapping or hostage-taking. It was actually a calculated diplomatic move that both sides understood. The Congo nobles who traveled to Lisbon weren't prisoners. They were ambassadors who would learn Portuguese language and customs, then return to serve as interpreters and cultural bridges. This is where the story gets really complex, because what happened next reveals the moral contradictions at the heart of the Age of Exploration. On one hand, the Portuguese were genuinely impressed by Congo civilization. They recognized that they were dealing with a sophisticated society that deserved diplomatic respect. Portuguese chroniclers wrote detailed accounts of Congo cities, government and culture that painted a picture of a truly advanced civilization. But on the other hand, the Portuguese had already decided that their ultimate goal was to convert this entire kingdom to Christianity. They weren't just exploring or trading, they were planning to fundamentally transform Congo society according to European religious and cultural values. It's a perfect example of the paternalistic mindset that would define European colonialism for centuries to come. When Cão returned to Congo in 1485 with the Congo nobles, the ruling king, Nzinga Nkuvu, decided to become Christian and sent a large diplomatic mission to Europe. But here's the question that should make us uncomfortable. Was this a genuine religious conversion, or was it a strategic political decision by a king who understood that aligning with Portuguese Christianity might be the best way to protect his kingdom's independence? The ethical dilemma here is staggering. The Portuguese genuinely believed they were bringing salvation and civilization to Africa. From their perspective, they were offering the Congo people access to European knowledge, technology, and eternal salvation through Christianity. They saw themselves as benevolent civilizers, not conquerors. But from a modern perspective, we can see the profound arrogance in this attitude. The Congo kingdom already had its own sophisticated civilization, its own religious traditions, its own systems of government and law. Who gave the Portuguese the right to decide that all of this needed to be replaced with European alternatives? The tragedy is that both sides were operating with incomplete understanding of the other. The Portuguese couldn't imagine that African civilization might be different from European civilization without being inferior to it. And the Congo leadership couldn't fully understand how European expansion worked, that trade relationships and religious conversion were often just the first steps toward political domination. What makes this story even more poignant is that the initial relationship between Portugal and Congo was built on mutual respect and genuine diplomatic exchange. The Congo kingdom wasn't conquered by military force. It was gradually transformed through a combination of religious conversion, economic integration, and cultural influence that was far more subtle and complex than simple colonization. But the seeds of future conflict were already being planted. The Portuguese were looking at the wealth and organization of the Congo kingdom and calculating how it could be incorporated into their expanding empire. They were making plans that would eventually lead to the exploitation of Congo resources and the disruption of Congo society, even as they maintained the diplomatic fiction of partnership and alliance. Did you know that Portugal almost went to war with Congo because of a misunderstanding about gold? Comment below. How far does the right to civilize another people really go? If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, smash that like button and share it with your friends. In 1486, Diogo Cão embarked on what would become one of history's most haunting mysteries. After the diplomatic success of his previous voyage, when he had established contact with the Congo kingdom and brought African nobles to Portugal, King John II was eager to push Portuguese exploration even further south. Cão was the obvious choice to lead this ambitious expedition. He knew the African coast better than any living European, and he had proven his diplomatic skills in dealing with African kingdoms. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Imagine the scene as Cão's ships departed from Lisbon for what everyone expected to be another triumphant voyage of discovery. The holds were loaded with the usual supplies: food, water, weapons, and those precious stone pillars that would mark Portuguese claims to new territories. The crew was experienced. Having sailed with Cão on previous expeditions, the king's expectations were high and the potential rewards were enormous. Everything seemed set for another successful exploration. Yet from the moment those ships disappeared beyond the horizon, they vanished from history as completely as if they had sailed off the edge of the world. What makes this mystery so compelling is that we know Cão reached the African coast and continued his explorations. Evidence shows that he made it at least as far south as Cape Cross in present-day Namibia, where he erected another of his stone pillars. A map published in 1489 by Henricus Martellus Germanus shows a stone pillar near Serra Parda with the ominous inscription "Et hic moritur," which means, "and here he died." But even this evidence raises more questions than it answers. Did Cão actually die at Serra Parda? Or was this just the mapmaker's assumption based on the fact that no one had heard from the expedition? Some historical accounts suggest that Cão might have returned to Congo and brought another native envoy back to Portugal, which would mean he survived longer than the map indicates. The theories about what happened to Diogo Cão and his men read like a collection of adventure stories, each more dramatic than the last. The first and most obvious possibility is shipwreck. The African coast was treacherous, filled with hidden reefs, unpredictable currents, and violent storms. Many explorers of this era simply vanished into the ocean, their ships broken apart by forces they couldn't predict or control. Given the primitive navigation tools of the 15th century, it would have been remarkably easy for an entire expedition to be lost to the sea. But there's another possibility that's even more chilling: disease. The African coast was a graveyard for European explorers, not because of hostile tribes or dangerous animals, but because of tropical diseases that European immune systems couldn't handle. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and countless other illnesses killed more explorers than all the wars and shipwrecks combined. Cão and his men might have succumbed to disease somewhere along the coast, their bodies buried in unmarked graves by survivors who then died themselves before they could return to Portugal. The third theory is the most dramatic, that Cão and his expedition were killed by hostile African tribes. While his previous encounters with the Congo Kingdom had been diplomatic and peaceful, not all African societies welcomed European visitors. As Portuguese explorers pushed further south, they moved beyond the sphere of influence of kingdoms that had established relationships with Portugal. They would have encountered societies that had never seen Europeans before, societies that might have viewed these strange visitors as threats to be eliminated. What makes this mystery even more poignant is that the exact fate of Diogo Cão is not known, despite centuries of historical research and speculation. Here was a man who had achieved everything an explorer of his era could dream of. He had discovered new lands, established diplomatic relationships with foreign kingdoms, and expanded the boundaries of known world. Yet his story ends not with triumph, but with an ellipsis, a question mark that history has never been able to answer. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Cão's disappearance is how it didn't stop Portuguese exploration. It accelerated it. Diogo Cão's discoveries accelerated Portuguese exploration of the sea route to India, and Vasco da Gama relied on his maps in his voyage. The knowledge that Cão had gained, the relationships he had established, and the routes he had mapped became the foundation for everything that followed. When Vasco da Gama set sail in 1497 to find the sea route to India, he wasn't venturing into completely unknown territory. He was following pathways that Diogo Cão had blazed, using information that Cão had gathered, building on diplomatic relationships that Cão had established. Da Gama's first voyage was the first to link Europe and Asia using an ocean route that rounded the southern tip of Africa. But this achievement was only possible because of the groundwork that explorers like Cão had laid. The voyage of Diogo Cão up the Congo River established the Portuguese as a major power in West Africa, and as a result of this journey, political and economic alliances were created that would change the history of both West Africa and South America. The Portuguese Empire, that would eventually span 4 continents and last for centuries, had its roots in the courage and curiosity of men like Diogo Cão. In the end, Diogo Cão's greatest legacy might not be what he discovered, but what he made possible for others to discover. His disappearance became a challenge, a mystery that inspired other explorers to push even further, to take even greater risks, to refuse to let the unknown remain unknown. Every Portuguese ship that rounded the Cape of Good Hope, every trading post established in Africa, every diplomatic relationship forged between Europe and African kingdoms, all of it traced back to the courage of a man who was willing to sail into the void and never return. The irony is devastating. Diogo Cão vanished just as his greatest dreams were about to be realized. He never lived to see Vasco da Gama reach India, never witnessed the Portuguese Empire that his discoveries had made possible, never knew that his name would be remembered centuries later as one of the pioneers of the age of exploration. He disappeared into mystery just as history was about to vindicate everything he had worked for. Here's the haunting truth about Diogo Cão's story. He never lived to see what his voyages ultimately unleashed upon the world. When he disappeared somewhere off the African coast in 1486, he died believing he had achieved something magnificent. He had discovered new lands, established diplomatic relationships with sophisticated African kingdoms, and expanded the boundaries of human knowledge. In his mind, he was a hero of exploration, a man who had proven that courage and curiosity could triumph over fear and superstition. But history has a way of revealing consequences that the people who set events in motion never intended or imagined. The diplomatic relationships that Cão established with the Congo Kingdom, relationships that began with mutual respect and genuine cultural exchange, would eventually become the foundation for one of history's most devastating tragedies, the transatlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Congo would eventually fall to scheming nobles, feuding royal factions, and the transatlantic slave trade, with an increase in Bakongo slaves being sold across the Atlantic. The Portuguese trading posts that grew from Cão's discoveries became collection points where millions of African men, women and children were gathered, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic to lives of bondage in the Americas. The knowledge of African geography that Cão had painstakingly gathered, mapping coastlines and river mouths, became the blueprint for a system of human exploitation that would persist for centuries. The sophisticated Congo Kingdom that had so impressed the Portuguese with its cities, its government, and its diplomatic protocols was gradually weakened and eventually destroyed by the very European relationships that had begun with such promise. Relations between Portugal and Congo soured, culminating in the Battle of Mbuila on October 29, 1665, which ended in Portuguese victory and the decapitation of the ruling Manicongo, Antonio Fausto. But perhaps most tragically of all, Cão's voyages were among the first steps in a process that would fundamentally reshape the entire world. His discoveries helped launch the age of European colonialism, an era that would see entire continents conquered, their resources extracted, their peoples enslaved or displaced, and their cultures suppressed or destroyed. The globalization that began with explorers like Cão would create wealth and power for some nations, while devastating others. This doesn't mean that Diogo Cão was a villain or that his courage and curiosity were worthless. It means that human actions have consequences that extend far beyond the intentions of the people who perform them. Cão wanted to expand Portuguese trade and bring Christianity to Africa. He probably never imagined that his voyages would contribute to centuries of exploitation and suffering. The stone pillars that Cão erected along the African coast were meant to be monuments to Portuguese achievement and Christian faith. But they became symbols of something much more complex and troubling, the beginning of European domination over the rest of the world. Those same pillars that marked Portuguese claims to African territory became the legal foundation for colonial systems that would persist into the 20th century. Yet here's what makes Cão's story ultimately meaningful rather than simply tragic. His courage to challenge the unknown was genuine, and that courage is something the world still needs. The problem wasn't that he dared to explore. The problem was that the world he came from wasn't ready to encounter other civilizations as equals rather than as territories to be conquered or converted. Diogo Cão proved that the world didn't end at the horizon, that there were always new lands to discover, new peoples to meet, new knowledge to gain. That spirit of exploration and discovery has given humanity some of its greatest achievements: scientific breakthroughs, artistic innovations, technological advances that have improved life for people everywhere. The question his story poses to us is profound. What are we willing to risk to discover the unknown? But perhaps more importantly, when we do discover something new, are we prepared to encounter it with respect rather than conquest, with curiosity rather than domination, with humility rather than arrogance? In our modern age, we face our own unknowns: climate change, artificial intelligence, space exploration, genetic engineering. We have the same choices that Diogo Cão and his contemporaries faced. We can approach these challenges with wisdom or with recklessness, with cooperation or with competition, with consideration for all humanity or with concern only for ourselves. Diogo Cão's courage took him beyond the edge of the known world. The question for us is whether we have the wisdom to ensure that our own explorations lead to discovery rather than destruction, to knowledge that benefits everyone rather than power that serves only a few. His story reminds us that every great achievement carries within it the seeds of great responsibility. The same human qualities that enable us to achieve remarkable things, curiosity, ambition, courage, determination, can also lead us to cause remarkable harm if we're not careful about how we use them. So what do you think? If this video took you on a journey through time, hit that like button, Share it with your friends and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible historical adventures until our next voyage into the past.